All right, so I'm going to get started here. 1 second while I get the recording on. Okay, hi everyone. Hope you're all doing well out there. Welcome to another Getaway live author event, which is part of Soho Crime's newsletter series that introduces mystery readers just like you to a new series every Tuesday from now through August. Before I pass it over to our wonderful speakers today, I just want to let you know that even if you are muted, you are in no way silenced. Please feel free to use the chat function to type out any questions you may have or let us know of any conversation topics you'd like to hear more about. My colleague Alexa and I will be monitoring the chat and filtering questions to the speakers while they're in conversation. And there'll be a more traditional sort of Q&A at the end as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator for the evening, Soho Crime Editorial Director, Juliet Grames. Oh, you're muted, Juliet, sorry. Try to unmute you.
Hi, everybody. You're in no way silenced, but I was for a second. Thanks, Peter. Just kidding. I'm so excited to see everyone here. What a fantastic crowd we have with two of my favorite people. So without further ado, let me introduce them. First, we have Francine Stephanie Mathews, who's actually two authors. Why I use her full name. And we at Soho have the privilege of publishing both of those authors, Francine Mathews and Stephanie Barron. Her wide-ranging career has covered so many wonderful books that we're going to talk about today, but I want to tell you first about my point of origin with Francine. Actually, it was with Stephanie. I was a huge fan of her Jane Austen series, the Being a Jane Austen Mystery novels, which I had read before we published them here at Soho. And her agent somehow figured that out, very intelligent agent, and approached me. And ever since then, we've had the great privilege of publishing both so Stephanie Barron's Jane Austen Mysteries, which featured Jane Austen as sleuth, are based on the actual letters and nonfiction historical biographies of Jane Austen, beautifully written and researched and just wonderful, wonderful mysteries. But we also get to publish the Francine Mathews novels, which are, for us, the Nantucket series, most recently, Death on Tuckernuck. These books feature a wonderful Nantucket local female detective, Merry Folger, who is the third-generation police detective in the crusty, isolated, wonderfully atmospheric New England island of Nantucket. And Tuckernuck, which just came out during the pandemic. Poor Francine here had to launch a book right in the earliest weeks of lockdown. And she's been such a wonderful sport about it. But this book is so exceptional. It is the story of a hurricane bearing down on Nantucket over Labor Day weekend. And Merry Folger, the detective who is supposed to be getting married this weekend, actually has to solve a murder during a hurricane. It's a beautiful book that brings in both the small town charm of Nantucket as well as real life worries like climate change and weddings, all of which I find very stressful. But yeah, it's really seriously a beautiful summer read that I highly recommend to everyone. But I was going to say, what I didn't know about Francine when I was reading her Jane Austen novels, and that I didn't learn until after we were working together, is in fact, before she became a writer, she was a CIA agent. And it just was, I think the epiphany I had when I learned that this woman who writes these beautifully researched 19th century Jane Austen historical novels was also a CIA agent, was a spy. She's a super spy. I think that little dichotomy kind of encapsulates Francine and her dual natures. So I'm very excited to introduce both of her to you today and to talk about all of her books and the diversity of them. So thank you, Francine. And then I have the man of not the hour, but the year, Peter Lovesey, who is with us today from England, which it happens to be his pub date for his newest novel, but I say he is the man of the year because Peter Lovesey in 2020 is celebrating his 50th anniversary as a crime fiction writer. His diamond anniversary, as it were. We at Soho have declared that 2020 is the year of Peter Lovesey. We Soho Press is not 50 years old, so Peter Lovesey's mystery career is, you know, something we only wish we could have claimed all credit for. But we are so honored to have many of his books in print with us, including the entirety of his Inspector Peter Diamond series, which is set in Bath and features a rather curmudgeonly technophobe detective, Peter Diamond. So, you know, Diamond Anniversary, Diamond Mystery. The latest one, The Finisher, is a really excellent mystery about a half marathon that is run through the town of Bath, the gorgeous old cathedral town of Bath. And if you've read Peter, I don't need to tell you that it's going to be a charming, wonderfully plotted, tongue-in-cheek, often laugh out loud, funny mystery, and it's going to move you to tears, and you're just going to love it. But what I may need to tell you is that with The Finisher, Peter is actually returning to his roots. His debut novel, which was called Wobble to Death, which was published in 1970, also about running, about a foot race. And Soho is really excited to be reissuing Wobble to Death as a collectible special edition this fall to celebrate Peter. But that's the first book in his Sergeant Cribb series, which is a Victorian London detective. And I think I probably shouldn't talk too much more about these two authors because I have too much to say. So let me conclude with welcome, both of you. Thank you so much for being here today. And would you tell us a little bit about yourselves in your own words? Francine, can we start with you?
Yes, I am not a CIA agent, Juliet. Oh, that's the pet peeve of everybody who's ever worked in intelligence. You don't refer to CIA employees as agents.
Analysts.
Agents are the people they run, who are committing treason.
Okay, she's not a boss. She's not a spy. She's the boss of spies. I'm so sorry, Francine. That was
No, I couldn't let that stand because anybody with any intelligence background, not with any intelligence, but with any intelligence background would object to the term CIA agent. So if you are in ops in the field, you are a case officer. If you are working in Langley interpreting the intelligence that comes back from the field, you are an analyst. And I was an analyst.
But if you are, sorry, but I'm interrupting, but if you are a spy, Francine, you're not going to admit it to us, are you?
Oh, right. You got me, Peter. So I just bring it up, Juliet, because there's not a huge disparity between being a detective novelist and being an intelligence analyst, in that you're both kind of employed in deductive reasoning and constructing and working puzzles. And so I think it's a personality trait that is conducive to both professions. Also, it really helps if you're an analyst. And in fact, the CIA hires accordingly if you are an introvert. And analysts tend to be introverts who are really comfortable spending a lot of time alone with their computer terminals in dark rooms. And that's all I've done for the past 27 years. So it's really not as shocking as one might think.
Well, okay, as gracefully as you've skirted over these how you became a spy stories, can I draw you out a little bit on those? How did you become a spy, Miss Introvert?
I called my mother, and she was this very quiet, conservative, widowed Irish Catholic woman living in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And I had just gotten out of grad school, and I could not get a job because I had no skills. After 7 years of higher education, the only thing I could do was read and write. And apparently they're not willing to pay for that in DC, so I was unemployable. And I started doing what you do in DC, which is you kind of Rolodex hop. No one has a Rolodex anymore, but you go from one recommendation to another and you speak to various people. And I finally ended up talking to a man named Bill Casey, gentleman Bill Casey. He was a Yale grad and original OSS operative during World War II, and he ran the CIA in the 1970s. And I was talking to him because his wife ran a think tank in Washington that I was trying to get hired by. And he just sort of picked up the phone and was chatting with me and said, you know, you really belong at the CIA, which to me was like being told I belonged in prostitution. I couldn't put it together that someone thought I belonged in espionage. And he was actually the third person that week in this Rolodex hopping who had said to me, you belong at the CIA. And so, you know, I felt like they were telling me to just go right down to that bordello and apply, you know. So I called my mom. I thought, who is the sanest person I can consult about this? And she said, well, now, Francie, when Anne Doyle's husband left her for that secretary and moved to Hawaii, she went right over to the CIA and got herself a job, and I think you should too. So I thought to myself, well, if it's okay with Mom, I'll call. And the rest is history.
Okay, so this is how you joined the CIA. How did you unjoin the CIA and segue into writing about Jane Austen?
I didn't. I wrote my first Merry Folger novel my last year at the agency. And I did that because I felt I wasn't born for a working life. This is part of being an introvert, by the way. As an introvert, you balk at having to be somewhere at 8 a.m. You balk at having a boss. You kind of balk at being told what to do with your time. And I had a vision of life where I got up in the morning and wrote some letters and had breakfast and changed my clothes, went for a walk in the garden, did a little writing, changed my clothes, went and visited friends, had tea. As I explained it to my husband, I wanted Jane Austen's life, you know, where writing was a part of her life, but her work didn't dominate and dictate all of her time, which to me seems like the penance that each of us pays in the modern world for being employed. We lose the bulk of our days to other people's whims and other people's demands. And that's the great sacrifice of modern life. We do it for money. So I mentioned this to my husband and he told me I was out of my mind, that I was a princess. And I said, but I was not born for this life. And he said, you're paid to think. You should be down on your knees thanking God for this job. I mean, do you know how few Americans are paid to think? Which is true, but I still felt like my life was being usurped. So he said to me, look, if you can write a book that actually has an ending and a beginning, we'll talk about you quitting your job. But I'm not going to let you quit your job. I'm not going to let you do that, which makes him sound terrible. But he was saying, I'm not going to let you do that to yourself, because he felt I had a profession. You write the book and then we'll discuss what you do with it. So he had given me a wager, and I felt it was important enough to me that I sat down and I wrote my first mystery novel, which is Death in the Off-Season, my first Nantucket mystery. And I was fortunate enough to be able to do that in the evenings after work, and sold it. And that was 27 years ago, and I've been writing ever since.
That is, I mean, a very inspiring story, and a reminder that, you know, so many authors go through when they're writing their first book, that
Right.
it's never allowed to be the thing that you prioritize, or that is
Exactly.
You know,
Exactly.
Peter, I think that you also were writing your first novel in between other commitments.
Yes, I was a teacher in a technical college for 16 to 19-year-olds primarily. And getting rather bored with it. And as Francine indicated, I'm an introvert too, and I don't really like having a boss around, and I don't like going to committee meetings and marking things and meeting parents, all those things. I was sort of a little bit bored with it all. Um, and sport was really my way in, because I was terribly interested in sport without being very good at it. In fact, I was terrible at running, or I couldn't catch a ball. But I wanted to be good at it. And when I went through school, the only way I could keep up with the other boys was by knowing so much more about sport than they did, what was going on. I read the newspapers, read magazines, listen to the radio. So I was well up on boxing and track and field and all the things that football, that is the soccer, the UK version of football, all of those things that boys are interested in, I knew far more about than they did, but I couldn't kick a ball and I couldn't run. And so I was a sort of athlete manqué. I spent my early years of trying very hard, but in the end I decided that I knew enough about it to begin to write some articles about sports, submitted them to a magazine, and of course they got rejected, and eventually found a way in by getting interested in the history of sports rather than what was going on currently. So I researched that, and the sport became, a real obsession with me. The history of it. I went to the newspaper library, which is at Colindale in North London, and worked my way through the newspaper. And they're like a time machine, those old newspapers. And in those days, you weren't working on microfilm. You really had the big bound volumes brought out to you on a trolley, and you put it on a big stand in front of you and turn the pages. And you would hear that something dreadful was happening, because Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's consort, was not very well. And then you turn a few more pages and Prince Albert is even more ill. And then the next page would be one with a dark edge, and you'd realize that poor Albert had gone. And then there was a lot of stuff about his life and the funeral and everything else. But I was interested in the old sports. And I came across accounts of a 19th century endurance contest called a wobble, which was a sort of go as you please contest. And it went on far longer than a modern marathon. It went on for 6 days inside the Agricultural Hall, Islington in London. And it got to be so popular, believe it or not. I mean, you think it would be terribly boring, these people going round and round a small track indoors, and retiring from time to time to sleep in little tents. They had trainers and there was betting, but huge crowds of 20 and 30,000 would assemble towards the end of these contests. Just amazing. And I got very intrigued with this, but couldn't see any way in which I could.
Peter, I'm sorry to interrupt. Could
Yes.
your microphone is rubbing against your collar. Could you just move?
Oh dear. Yes,
It's getting a little static. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yes.
Just getting to the good part too.
rapid. Is that better?
Perfect.
Oh, good.
Excellent. Yep.
Right. So where was I? I was going researching the wobbles, and in the end, I got some magazine articles published. I was confident enough then to try and write a book. And just at that time, I happened to be looking through the newspaper, and there was an advert in the Times, crime novel contest, cash prizes offered. For more information, write to Lord Harding at Macmillan Publishers. So I did, and I asked for the particulars, and they came back. And I have them here because they were very important to me. You'll see that there was something about it that was of interest to me.
Oh my God.
I didn't read the small print. £1,000. I mean, that was more than my salary as a teacher. So I entered the competition, wrote about my wobble and called it Wobble to Death. And I was lucky enough to win the prize. That was my start.
Wasn't luck.
It's
not luck.
It wasn't luck. I mean, Wobble to Death is a truly extraordinary book. It really, really is. It doesn't read like a debut novel at all. It reads like a guy who had maybe been sitting on a secret passion for a writing career all along and has just humbly couched it as if this was a whim as a sports lover who happened to write about a sport. I detect, because I've learned much detection from both of you, that there's more to that story, Peter.
Probably, yes. But anyway, it got me started, and when I went up to collect the prize, of course, the envelope was handed to me, and I went to take the £1,000 cheque, and it was nearly torn in half because Lord Harding, who was the editor at Macmillan, held on to it and said to me, you know, have you started the next one yet? And I thought, oh, what's this about? You know, obviously, they wanted to invest in an author and hoping that I would continue to write books. So I wrote 8 in the Victorian period, all the Sergeant Cribb series, and they did very well for me. I was happy doing it and researching my bits of Victoriana. Back to the newspaper library, of course, but enormous fun.
Peter, your microphone has slipped again.
Oh dear.
Yeah, sorry, it's actually hitting your collar. Yeah, there you go.
Better.
The rectangle.
Yeah.
Lift the rectangle.
Yeah.
It's that yellow rectangle that needs to rise.
Oh.
Yeah.
Right. How am I now?
Perfect.
Okay. Sorry
Perfect.
about these technical problems, but it shows that it's live, doesn't it? We're not recording this. This is the real thing.
I think that Peter's just trying to convince us that he has a lot biographically in common with Inspector Peter Diamond, the supposed technophobe. But you know,
yes,
it's all a lie. It absolutely is a lie. He's like, oh yes, I'm such a Luddite. Look at my beautiful social media platforms and my wonderful newsletter. Peter, I think you're amazing. So,
oh, go on.
So
I'm curious, Peter. Did you read detective fiction as a boy, or did you gravitate toward detective fiction simply because of the Macmillan contest?
A little bit of both. I read the Sherlock Holmes stories when I was a boy and loved them all. And I think about one Agatha Christie, which just gave me the idea of what a whodunit was all about.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that was about it by the time I'd read some Leslie Charteris, the Saint books.
Yes, the Saint. Yeah.
But yes, but that was all it was. And as you say, when you write your first one, then you begin to take an interest in what other people are doing and have done.
Yeah.
And you catch up fast, and I'm still catching up. I read about sort of one book by each author I meet, and haven't time really to go through the full backlist.
Yes, exactly. It's a vast sea of literature.
Yeah,
I grew up reading voraciously detective novels, and part of why I chose to write a mystery when my husband threw down that wager to me years ago was because I felt like I understood the architecture of a detective novel, and it was less overwhelming to contemplate writing a book if I had a sort of architecture to it. And I didn't feel equipped to sit down and write the great American novel, but I felt like I could sit down and write a detective novel because of the puzzle plot, that it gave you a framework, for a first novel. And that was useful to me. And I also felt like I was more comfortable writing the sort of book I loved to read. And so that made it more comprehensible for me.
Yes, it's lovely that there is already a structure in place, isn't there? That you, whatever else you do in the course of the story, you're going to have to explain everything at the end.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that is a real discipline, a terrific discipline. And I enjoy. I'm like you. I'm an introvert, and I do enjoy sort of working quietly at these things and seeing that it all comes right by the end, and that nobody's going to say, put the book down and say, well, I didn't understand a word of that.
It's a liability, though, as a writer, because when you read a mystery novel, you're applying that same logic. And of course, it's immensely frustrating if you do come to the end and have to throw it across the room because it doesn't work.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And yet you both had fun breaking the rules. I've seen you both do it quite a lot. So.
Well, yes, I say it's a wonderful genre, and you can play with it a great deal, but at the same time, it's no bad thing to go back to the people who did it really well, and
Mhm.
and read how they did it, and work out how to construct a puzzle,
Yeah.
and to deconstruct, say, an Agatha Christie
Yeah.
is quite an interesting exercise.
Yeah, in fact. And when I first set out to write Death in the Off-Season, my first mystery, I actually did go to writers I admired, Peter, and try to analyze their work to figure out the elements that worked for me and that I felt were important. I'm a huge Dorothy Sayers fan, and I do think a lot of the Golden Age mystery writers are brilliant at that sort of plotting. Michael Innes's Lament for a Maker, for example, is just such a fabulous read over multiple reads. I love Niall Marsh and Marjorie Allingham. My favorite Marjorie Allingham is The Tiger and the Smoke. I just think
yes,
it's brilliant.
mine too.
Brilliant moral fable.
Yes, yes, and that sort of transcends the traditional detective story. It's a
Totally does.
it's a thriller as well, and quite a thriller.
Yeah, she shifted from mystery to thrillers, and
Yes.
it's her finest work when she did that.
Well, I did want to talk about some points in common that you have, which is, I'm going to start with Bath, the town of Bath in England. So the Inspector Peter Diamond series, which has been Peter's front list publication platform for the last 10 years or so, is set in Bath. The inspector is chief superintendent of the Avon Somerset Murder Squad, and we get tons of Bath pictorial references throughout the books, and they're set there. Now, for Francine, Jane Austen, of course, those books are not usually set in Bath, but I feel like it's not possible to bring up Bath without thinking of Jane Austen. So I'm curious, what brought each of you to Bath? What is your relationship to Bath? And what would you like people to read about Bath in your books?
Well, I shall I go first? I lived near Bath for about 20 years, and it was our closest city. We would go in there and shop and wander about it, and it's beautiful, and I really enjoyed prowling around. And by that time, I was writing and getting ideas, but it was almost towards the end of the 20-year period that I started writing a series set in Bath with Diamond, or adjustments, that. The thing with Jane Austen was that I brought her into the very first book, The Last Detective, because of her aunt, who was a shoplifter. Who was accused of being a shoplifter, let's say, although I rather believe
she was a shoplifter.
Wasn't. Yes, good. I'm glad we agree on that. Yes, yeah. Yes. And I was able to walk along Stall Street, where this incident took place, and go to the shop and look at the shop front. And at that time, it was a dress shop called Principals, which was rather ironic, really. But anyway, Aunt Jane, who was the rich aunt who the Austen family used to stay with, was sort of quite a respectable lady, and to be arrested as she came out of this shop with one card of lace too many, and she had gone in to buy white lace, I think, and she came out with a black one as well, and then we stopped and accused. Oh, it was dreadful, and not only that, but she was taken away and put in prison for a while. And there was a suggestion even that Jane and Cassandra, her sister, should go and visit.
Stay with her.
Yeah, yes. But it didn't. I think it didn't happen. I think Aunt Jane was good enough to say, well, it wouldn't be suitable for young girls to come into a prison. Yeah. But say the ironic thing is, for me, that Jane Austen really wasn't terribly happy in Bath, and I think that was one of the reasons. the associations with that particular case. Um, I, the story is that I'm sure you've heard this one, Francine, that when when the parents at Steventon decided that they thought that they would go and move to Bath, that Jane fainted at the shock of it.
Yeah.
And finally, when they left it, after enduring the heat of in those clothes that they wore, and finding it very oppressive, as it is, because it's a city built in around between 7 hills. So in the summer it gets quite difficult, as anybody who knows Bath would agree. When she came away after, they went to live in Clifton afterwards, I think, and she wrote a letter saying, it's now 2 years since we left Bath, with what happy feelings of escape, which you know is quite interesting, because so many people associate Jane with Bath and think, oh, you know, Northanger Abbey, Persuasion, she must have loved the place. But several of her characters were quite critical of it. And I'm sorry, I'm going on about it. Francine, you write about Jane, so do
No, I
take
agree with
over.
everything. I agree with everything you've said, Peter. You know, her most revealing sentiments about Bath, I find, are in Persuasion, where Anne Elliot is allowed to speak with her voice and finds Bath depressing. And in Anne's case, she lost her mother while being a student, a young student at a finishing school, a seminary for ladies in Bath, which is, of course, parallel to Jane's experience of losing her father while they lived in Bath. And so she associated it with grief and with mourning and loss. And it was never a place that she valued as we, 200 years on, value it for its beauty. And she'll say, you know, little asides like, oh, it always rains in Bath. And so you get that sense of real disinclination for the city,
Yes.
which a lot of Austen enthusiasts don't quite understand, but is very, very real. I enjoyed setting certain books about Jane and stories. I did a short story for you, Juliet, for the Christmas collection in Bath. One of the books, Jane and the Wandering Eye, is set during Austen's period of living in the city. And so that was quite a lot of fun, because it was a story that dealt with theater in the town, as well as the lives of the wealthy who would repair to Bath for restorative intervals, drinking the waters, and enjoying the society. So there's a whole rich cultural history around, as Peter would tell you, that whole period of Georgian into Regency England, in the spa culture. And I'm actually writing about that right now in a different spa town, Cheltenham, where Jane Austen went in 1816 as she was beginning to be ill, and took the waters with her sister in an effort to try to cure herself of the disease that would eventually kill her a year later. So that's been quite interesting to research. But personally, I was lucky enough to stay at a country house hotel 11 miles outside of Bath called Stonyton Park when I was researching yet another Jane Austen novel, because Stonyton had a Repton garden, and it had the original Humphrey Repton garden book. And I was writing about, Jane references Humphrey Repton and his gardens in Mansfield Park, where the wealthy young heir is going to inherit a home, and they're recommending that he put follies in and he tear out the Constable gardens and bring in instead the sort of Gothic and romantic look of Humphrey Repton. So I got to visit an actual still extant Repton garden at Stonyton Park, and it's a Palladian style manor from Austen's period. And that is where I saw this wonderful painting of servants from that time, from about 1810. And it was a grouping of servants, and it was hanging in the library at Stone Easton Park. And I said, what is the story of this painting? Because it was unusual to have a painting of servants.
Oh, yes.
And they told me, that is the butler, that is the housekeeper, that is the still-room maid. The butler was married to the housekeeper, had an affair with the still-room maid, and the housekeeper killed the still-room maid. And so I thought immediately, it was like I'd been struck by lightning, Jane and the still-room maid. And I had the title of my next book.
Oh, yes, yes.
I didn't actually use the plot of the intrigue among the servants, but something about Jane and the still-room maid just hit me as it had to be a title. And it was such a rich visit to Bath and to Stone Easton Park, and it contributed to multiple books in the series.
Oh, I can understand. Yes,
Really
you have a great ear for titles. Anyway, I think they're
oh, thank
wonderful. You. Yes, yes, and I love I hadn't heard about The Wandering Eye, Jane and the Wandering.
Yes,
that's
The Wandering Eye.
That's a terrific one.
You know what it turns around, Peter, is Regency eye portraits. You know, just the portrait of an eye, and you wore your lover's eye during the late Georgian and Regency period. Prinny wore Maria Fitzherbert's eye portrait, and it was supposed to be a great secret that only you knew the identity of the eye, and so that's what that book is built around, and it was wonderful to research.
Oh, great! Nothing to do with the private eye, obviously.
That's I think that one thing that this conversation has pointed out to me so far is that your respective oeuvres are so interesting that we can only touch on little tiny pieces of them. And so I actually want to try to force our hands to look at aspects of the oeuvres that often get overlooked these days. Like maybe they're books that were deep in your past, that you really love, that have stayed under your skin all this time, and that you would love for your readers today who may not have encountered them to know about them. Peter, you get to go first. Now, I didn't even get to mention this before. I apologize. So Peter Lovesey is both the Mystery Writers of America Grandmaster, as well as the Crime Writers Association of the UK Diamond Dagger Award winner for Lifetime Achievement. He's one of only 3 such living legends. He has a count, I believe we hit 40. Did we hit 40 novels, Peter? I for your last bio, I think we updated it to say that he is the author of 40 novels. Is that about right?
Something like that. Yes. Yes. I don't.
So tell us, in 40.
It is about right.
Is there a book that you would love to resurface?
There's a book called Rough Cider, which I wrote a long time ago, and that is set partly in Bath, but also in Reading and places. That's quite close to my own experiences as a child. It's the book that's nearest to my growing up. I grew up during the war, and we were bombed out. One of those flying bombs hit our house. And fortunately I was at school, and my mother had gone shopping, and my 2 brothers were under an iron tabletop shelter called a Morrison shelter inside the house. And the whole thing, well, the bomber came down in the garden, and the house was completely demolished, and they were dug out alive, and it was just a miracle. But as a result, we were homeless, and we had sort of no clothes, no books, nothing, and we were evacuated, which was a term that was used then, to the country. And my mother, that is my father was a soldier, so he was away, but my mother and the 3 boys then were taken to a farm in the West Country, where we lived in rather difficult circumstances, because we weren't welcome guests. We were billeted, was the word. We were sort of forced on these people. And out of that came this book, Rough Cider, about a child who finds himself on a farm where he's rather unwelcome, and the only friendship he has is with an American GI who has come over during the war years, and he gets to know the GI, and I'd say it's pretty close to my own experiences. I got to know some GIs when I was a kid, and was taken to some wonderful parties at the local American Air Base because I was a homeless kid. You know, they sort of had a lot of sympathy for me. So that's a very personal book, and one that I like.
Yeah, excellent recommendation.
Mm.
Thank you, Peter. I think everyone should read Rough Cider. It really is. But so, Francine, actually, and before I ask you what your book is, would you please explain to our gentle guests today the difference between Francine Mathews and Stephanie Barron? Because I don't think I did that justice.
So the Francine Mathews books tend to be grittier crime novels. But Nantucket isn't that gritty, but it's police procedural work, as opposed to the Jane Austens, which are amateur detectives that are historical in nature. I find that I also write espionage novels as Francine Mathews, some of them more contemporary than others, but the majority are set in World War II. And so I tend to think that more men read the Francine Mathews books than the Stephanie Barron books. As Stephanie Barron, I've written not just the Jane Austens, but most recently a book called That Churchill Woman, which is not a mystery at all, not espionage. It's straight up biographic fiction about Jenny Jerome, Winston Churchill's American mother.
Really good read.
Thank you. And I've also written a book about Queen Victoria called A Flaw in the Blood, which is about hemophilia. I've written The White Garden, which is about Vida Sackville West and Virginia Woolf, and Virginia Woolf's disappearance. I say disappearance because The White Garden turns on the fact that Woolf disappeared one day, leaving a note behind that did not explicitly say she was going to kill herself. It merely said she couldn't go on. She put on a fur coat and her Wellingtons and walked out of her house, and her body was not found for 3 weeks. And so my editor and I were talking about writing a novel around Sissinghurst and the White Garden, and she said, you know, they didn't find her for 3 weeks. And immediately I thought, what if she went to Vida when she couldn't go on? Now, of course, that meant that ultimately her body had to come out of a river 3 weeks later. But the book became that story. And so I've done a variety of things, but as Stephanie Barron, but I think they tend to appeal to female readers. And while I hesitate to say they are women's fiction, because that's a label that's much in disapprobation right now, they do tend to appeal to women readers more, I think. And often they're more historical.
Francine, what's the title of the Vida Sackville West novel?
The White Garden.
The White Garden. Great. What a
Yeah.
great recommendation. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's set at Sissinghurst primarily. And it's about the Bloomsbury Group and the apostles at Cambridge. That's the suspense aspect.
Okay, well, I owe it to the audience to turn it over to them for questions now. But before I do, would either of you like to make a reading recommendation of not your books, but someone else's book to our gentle audience?
Go ahead, Peter.
I like Walter Mosley's books enormously. I'm waiting for there's a new one has come out recently. I can't remember the title, but I'm waiting for it. Do you remember it, Juliet, or not?
I don't remember. It's supposed to be so good. It's getting incredible reviews. I'll look it up for you. I'll let you know.
So Walter Mosley from me, yes, and then I go right back to Raymond Chandler and Dashiell Hammett. I read them again and again because they're fun, and there are a lot of things you can say you can knock now in those books, but there's so much you can love. How's it going? The research? This is good, isn't it? Oh,
Trouble
fine.
is What I Do. Good title, right?
Yeah, great. Thank you.
I didn't get to hear that. What is the title?
Trouble is What I Do.
Trouble is What I Do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
How about you,
It's
Fran?
like the opening line of The Poet, which I've always loved, by Michael Conley. Death is my beat.
Ah,
Mm.
It's his reporter series.
good one.
Yeah.
Francine, you're up.
Oh, recommendations. I am looking forward to 2 books this next few months. Daniel Silva's The Order, which is out, I believe, today. And I'm a huge Daniel Silva fan, so I can't wait to read that. And then I'm looking forward to James Benn's Red Horse, which is coming out in September. I'd also like to recommend, and this is from a year ago or so, but I was privileged to read it and vote for it for the Edgar Best Novel Award. And that is Attica Locke's Bluebird, Bluebird. Absolutely love that book. It was the first in a series, and the series is well worth reading. So
Attica Locke. She's the best. She's awesome. I've many
yeah, beautiful, beautiful writer. Actually several book groups read it on my recommendation because of its prose quality.
Okay, so I'm going to turn to audience questions now while we still have a little time. So the first question is for both authors. What inspired you to add a second series? Peter, you're up first.
Sorry, I didn't catch the last part of the.
What inspired you to
What inspired you to
write a second series?
Oh, yes. I think somehow series has its own natural length, and I felt with the very first series, the Sergeant Cribb ones, that they had reached the limit. And another factor there was that it became a television series. And they asked me then if I would write together with my wife, who was very much involved with me in the writing then, a second TV series. So I used up all the ideas that I had in store for Sergeant Cribb, and that was the end of it, really. I then had to look around. I started writing some standalone books and did several of those. The one I mentioned earlier, Rough Cider, was one of them. But I was still thinking, okay, there's another series in me. I did 3 on about Bertie, the Prince of Wales, which were great fun as a detective, hopeless detective, but you had to read between the lines and realise what was going on. And then I thought, well, it's time I wrote something contemporary. And Peter Diamond and the Bath series of books was it. I had to pluck up a lot of courage and write some contemporary short stories before I felt I could move about in the modern world with a police series. But I'm glad I did.
How about you, Francine?
You know, a couple of things. I was pregnant with my first son, who's now going to be 26 in November. And I was reading Austen, as I often do. I started reading Austen when I was 12. And I think because for me, pregnancy is a hallucinatory state. I was hearing voices, and one of them was Jane's. And I started speaking in Jane's idiom, just in normal conversation. And it was driving me mad. And I thought, I really need to use this voice somehow. But I didn't want, and I was not interested in doing continuations of Jane Austen's novels, because I feel readers are very, very attached to their individual and personal conceptions of Lizzie Bennet or Charlotte Lucas or Anne Elliot, Marianne Dashwood. So I didn't want to invade Jane's world in that way. But I studied Napoleonic France and Regency England in college and was a history major. I have always loved that period and felt intuitively drawn to it. And so I thought, what if I could use Jane's language, the language from her books, but particularly the language of her letters, which is so much more intimate and vicious. And Jane's viciousness is a huge part of her attraction. She was an incredibly funny woman. You get a sense of her personality most vividly from her letters and her secondary characters in her novels, I think, where she's allowed to use her wit in crafting character. At any rate, I thought, what if I could use that language in a book that had a plot that would pull modern readers through the language, that they'd submit to the language if they follow. So I started experimenting with it during that pregnancy, and wrote my first Jane Austen novel, and that was the inspiration for the second series. But I had to use a different name simply because I was publishing with a different editor and publishing house, and they would not cross promote for the same name. So that was the compulsion. So I used my middle and maiden name.
So the answers to inspiring an entire second series are A, Hollywood made me do it, or pregnancy made me do it.
Yeah.
Voices made me do it. I mean, I think that's
Voices.
extraordinary. Yes,
Voices.
that's
I love it.
wonderful.
Okay, I have another audience question for both of you. This is about your writing process, especially how much time is invested in research, planning, drafting, and revising. Peter, you get to go first. Tell us about your process.
Oh gosh, yes. I try to keep myself busy most of the day at writing. I'm an early riser, so I'll be working from 6 o'clock, and I obviously take breaks to do a little bit of shopping or have I love a coffee out, so I have a coffee out most days. But I'm working through till about 6 in the evening, when I go and do some cooking. So that's the basic day, and I work 7 days a week while I'm on the novel. I'll have a bit of a rest when I finish the novel. As to the research, well, yes, I usually choose a subject that I'm interested in anyway, and I know quite a bit about. I still prefer doing my research from books, but it's easy to do it with the help of the internet these days, and you can visit the places using Google Earth, which is just wonderful to be able to sort of go to the street that you're trying to describe in Bath or wherever. But I mean, I call it research. It's fun. It's enormous fun, and I tend to do that as I'm going along. So I hope that answers the question.
I agree. I think research is just so much fun. And I love reading both of your books because they're so impeccably researched and plotted and both so clean. You're such clean, beautiful puzzle writers. I don't know what goes on in your brains, but I think they must be really magnificent. If only you could figure it out, tell me, give me a little blueprint for other writers. But Francine, tell us about your process.
You know, research is incredibly important to me. You always hear the adage, write what you know, and I think that's absolute bullshit. I think you write what you find interesting and educate yourself about it well enough to write about it masterfully. I find that a lot of the research requires me to assemble a working library. For instance, in writing about Queen Victoria, I assembled multiple biographies, and what I discovered is that each age had its own biographic picture of Victoria that was very illustrative of the age in which it was written as much as it was of her life. And that to me is fascinating about biography, that each biographer really reflects the culture from which he or she comes, as well as the subject. And so you get this kaleidoscopic view of a person if you're choosing to write about that person. The same is obviously true of Jane Austen. But I do write a great deal in World War II and have to research a lot about espionage. and the events surrounding the lives of leaders and common people in World War II. So I tend to have these significant libraries, shelves of books for each book I've written. But I agree with Peter that the digital process is fantastic in that, for example, in writing That Churchill Woman, I could, interestingly, in the United States, presidential libraries are open access. They're all digital. They're free. In writing about Winston Churchill's family, however, I had to subscribe for £600 a year to the Churchill Archive in order to get digital access to the Churchill archives.
Oh.
It was well worth it to me because it was a profound rabbit warren, not just a rabbit hole, but a rabbit warren. You would find letters from Jenny's father there, in facsimile, so you can pull them up on your screen and see his handwriting and decipher it. You had all of Winston's letters as a child from school written to Jenny, Jenny's letters to Randolph, Randolph's letters to Jenny. You start unpacking all of these things and you have a calendar and you can figure out which date they were writing to one another and where they were. And it is utterly fascinating to see the handwriting of the person you are inhabiting as a character. So that was an immensely rich sort of archive. In contrast, in writing a book of mine called Jack 1939, which is about Jack Kennedy in 1939, when he was a junior at Harvard and he took off the spring semester of college to research his senior thesis, just as Hitler was invading Czechoslovakia and preparing to take Poland. I was able to use the Kennedy Library, and that I visited in person as well as used digitally. But for example, they have such a vast holding that you can pull up every passport he ever owned when he was young. And at the time, pre-World War II, passports were issued only for the duration of a trip. And so you would apply for the passport, receive it, use it to travel, and then you had to turn it back into the passport office in New York when you got off your ship.
What a pain in the neck.
Pain in the neck. But as an archive, it's fascinating because I saw each of the passports, because his family traveled to Europe all the time. You'd see the description, his weight, what they called his eye color. So in some of his passports, his eyes are listed as blue, and some they're listed as green, and some they're listed as brown. And I realized what you don't find many places, Jack Kennedy had hazel eyes, and it depended what he was wearing. And so, and they have these little photographs of him as he's 15 and 13 and 17. And, you know, it's just, they're all in the Kennedy Library. They're fabulous things in those libraries. So the research becomes just utterly absorbing. And to answer the original question, I apologize. I can spend months doing the research, and I do a great deal of research from which my books organically seem to grow. I then find I do secondary rounds of research midway through the books as required. For example, I needed to learn about which tailoring houses in London catered to Americans and catered to diplomats, because the diplomatic wardrobe was specific and Americans patronized different tailors than, say, necessarily an English country gentleman would patronize in 1939. That in itself is fascinating. I say diplomats because Jack Kennedy was there as his father's son, who was an ambassador, and most of the functions he attended in London at the time were diplomatic functions. So that kind of little minute research you do as you go, because you reach a point in the book and realize, I'm sending him to the tailor, which tailor, right? And so it's a rolling process. And this may be too much detail for the questioner. She may just, or he may just have wanted to know, do we plot our books or do we let the muse strike? I'm a huge plotter, as I've probably already conveyed. I have to have an outline for my books. My books always diverge from those outlines, but without an outline, I don't have the basic blueprint of the structure of the novel.
Actually, I want to push you on that, and I want to hear Peter's response as well, because although we're supposed to be concluding this, someone did ask, what is the process with creating plot puzzles? And I want to hear this from each of you, because puzzle mysteries are actually pretty rare in the contemporary form, and you both do puzzle mysteries, fair play, discovery, by the detective and by the reader. I think that they're actually very difficult to write. So what would each of you say? What is your trick for creating a puzzle plot? What do you think?
Mine, I think, is I'm a planner too, I may say. I've got that in common with Francine. I always liked, when I started, I wrote a synopsis, chapter by chapter of the whole book. And I did that for the first few books. Now I carry a little bit more of it in my head. But when it comes to the working out the writing, I try to think, well, what's the obvious thing here? What is likely to happen? And then how can I subvert that and turn it into a surprising hook at the end of a chapter? And then that usually leads me on to something else afterwards, which sometimes it gets very, very difficult, and I have to go back and write things again. But this is all in the process of writing the outline. I do recommend doing that. Not everybody does. I mean, I usually find if I'm on a panel that I'm in the minority.
Yeah.
Most of them will say, "Oh no, I couldn't do that. I like the excitement of looking at the blank screen and not knowing. I couldn't do that. I just couldn't. I've got to know."
Peter, but tell us honestly, from an outline, have you ever been writing diligently along and then been surprised that the murderer was not who you thought it was, or the crime was not what you thought it was when you came to the end? Has that ever happened? No.
No, I've had the situation where the character tells me, "I'm not going to do what you planned for me,"
Right.
And that happened with in the Last Detective, the first book of the Peter Diamond series. It was called The Last Detective because it was going to be a standalone, a sort of one-off book, and towards the end he resigns from the police. And there's a bit of a row and he gets into trouble. He's called up before the chief constable and told, "Well, you know, you really can't behave like this." And the chief constable wants him to stay on just to give him a reprimand. But Diamond, being the man he is, he said to me, "I'm not going to I'm leaving this lot. I'm quitting." So he did. He left the police and he managed to solve the crime in spite of not being a policeman anymore. But of course, that left me with a huge headache when the book was quite successful. And I was told, "Well, you know, what's coming next? You must carry on with this character." So I had to find a way of getting him back into the police.
How about you, Francine?
And it took me 3 books to do it. So that was, yes. Yeah.
It's really good. Francine, tell us about your trick plots, and then I have to let everybody go so that they don't yell at me.
Sure. So actually it was Jeremiah Healy, who is now the late Jeremiah Healy, mystery author, who gave me, without knowing me, the key to plotting for me, which is, he had written an article about it and he said, always begin with the end and work backwards when you are outlining. And I think in mystery plotting, this is particularly useful because the culmination of the mystery, the ending of the book, is so critical. If you know, and by ending, there are 2 endings. There's the plot ending, and there is the ending of the arc of growth of the characters. And you have to have them both, and they have to both be satisfying for the reader. By ending, what you're essentially asking yourself is, what would cause someone to kill another person? If you know why someone would kill another person, which is really the denouement of a mystery novel, you understand suddenly a great deal about them. You understand their mutual animosity, their connection that motivates violence. And from that, you understand a little bit about each of them individually. And then you get a bigger circle beyond that, which is their community, what unites them, what divides them. And suddenly you have rings moving out on a pond that establish the whole world surrounding these 2 people and their motivation for violence. That is revealed at the end, but once you know that, you can then work backwards and decide at what point am I going to begin this story? Where do I want in the stream of the story to put my foot in the water and launch? And so that's kind of the modus vivendi for me. I always start with who did what to whom and why, and work backwards.
You also have never been surprised by the
Always. No, I'm often surprised. And in fact, I fundamentally believe if that doesn't, so I always outline, but if the book does not diverge from the outline, I don't feel that the creative process has happened. The creative process is when the book diverges from the outline. And like Peter, I would say it is driven by the characters, because when you outline the book, you're imposing actions on a group of people you don't know yet. Once they start speaking and talking to each other, they take over the story, and that very much drives the outcome. And you cannot impose your direction entirely on characters who have assumed life, because they need to have integrity in their actions, and that integrity is dictated by their personalities, like Diamond. And you can't force actions on them that are incompatible with who they are. And you don't know who they are really until they start speaking. This sounds very woo-woo, but I think most writers would say that this is the process that happens in your head.
That's beautifully explained. You said it all, and you said it for me too. That's wonderful. I really enjoyed listening to you.
Well, I love listening to you, Peter. We'll go out for a coffee. We're in the same country, okay?
Right.
Thank you both so much. Thank you everyone for coming today, and Peter and Francine. This has been such an honor for me. So I'll turn it over to Stephen now. But thank you everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, Juliet, and Francine, so much for doing this. This was a delightful conversation. And thank you for all you readers and viewers out there. Thanks for joining. You'll be seeing in your inbox a Getaway newsletter. There'll be a mega excerpt for the book we're featuring this week. It's The Bishop's Wife by Meddy Harrison. And there will be a couple more events like this before the end of the summer. So tune in. Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks, Steve. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Peter. Bye, Juliet.
Bye.
Kiss that baby for me, Juliet.
I will kiss him 3 times for you.